I want you to start by picturing a capitalist, just for a second.
Yeah.
When I say that word, what pops into your head?
For most people, it's probably a Wall Street guy in a suit, right, shouting into a phone.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe if you remember your history class, you think of uh, a very stern 17th century Protestant merchant, the guy driven by that famous Protestant work ethic.
Right, the guy in the black hat who works like 18 hours a day because he's terrified of hell.
That's him. And that is the standard story we've all been taught. It comes from Max Weber, the sociologist, back in 1905. The whole idea is that capitalism, this entire economic engine we live in today, was basically invented by Calvinists because they were so anxious about salvation.
It's a very neat, tidy story. It connects all the dots.
It does. It connects religion, psychology, money, all perfectly. But what if that widely accepted fact isn't just a little bit off, but chronologically impossible?
And that's putting it mildly. I mean, if you actually look at the hard data, the timeline is.
Yeah.
It's completely broken.
And that's the twist in our deep dive today. We're digging into a source that argues the first true capitalists weren't Protestant merchants in the 1600s.
Not even close.
They were medieval Catholic monks living hundreds of years earlier. We're talking about a complete rewrite of the economic timeline.
It's a fascinating pivot. And the mission for this deep dive is to unpack a really detailed critique of Max Weber's famous theory. We're going to look at the historical evidence that, locates the origins of rational, systematic economics, what we would technically define as capitalism inside monastery walls.
Okay, so we've got a source that challenges a century of sociological dogma. Where do we even start with this?
Well, we have to start with the source itself. It's a pretty rigorous analysis that contrasts Weber's theory with actual historical data about medieval monastic estates. It forces us to ask, what even is capitalism? And if we define it correctly, who was doing it first?
All right, let's unpack this. Before we tear Weber down, we should probably remind everyone what his argument actually was. Because I hear the phrase Protestant work ethic thrown around all the time, even now.
Oh, it's a cliche. And people often use it without realizing where it comes from. Weber's observation was, on the surface, pretty simple. He looked at mixed regions in Europe, places with both Catholics and Protestants, and he saw a pattern.
The Protestants seemed to be doing better financially.
Right. They were wealthier, they owned more businesses, they were more likely to study technical subjects instead of the humanity.
And his explanation for this wasn't just, they're smarter or something. He went straight to their theology. He made it about belief.
Precisely. He pinned it on predestination. In Calvinist theology, God has already decided before you're even born if you are going to heaven or hell, and you can't change it.
Which sounds, frankly, terrifying. You're just waiting to find out your fate.
It creates a terrible existential anxiety. Am I one of the elect? Am I chosen? So according to Weber, these believers started looking for clues, for signs. They came to believe that worldly success, wealth, a growing business, a thriving farm, was a sign of God's favor.
So because they couldn't earn their salvation, they worked harder than anyone to prove to themselves they already had it. It's a paradox.
Exactly. They became the first workaholics, but here's the key part. They were ascetics. They didn't spend the money on parties or fancy clothes or, buying rounds at the tavern.
They saved it.
They saved it. They reinvested it. And Weber argued this specific psychological cocktail making money but refusing to enjoy it is what created the capital accumulation needed to kickstart the whole modern economy.
It sounds so logical. It's a great story. But our source material today basically takes a sledgehammer to this. So where does the crack start?
The first crack is statistical. And this is a big one. Our source points out that while Weber seems scientific, he was using observations, he didn't really have the tools to prove his point. He lacked modern statistical methods, like something called discriminant factorial analysis.
Okay, discriminant factorial analysis sounds like jargon designed to just end the conversation. What does that actually mean?
It's a fancy way of saying he couldn't isolate his variables.
Yeah.
Just because two things happen at the same time, like Protestantism and wealth, doesn't mean one caused the other. It's the classic correlation is not causation error.
Right, like more ice cream is sold in the summer and more people get sunburned in the summer, so ice cream must cause sunburns.
Exactly. And the source gets even more specific about Weber's sloppy data. For instance, he often just assumed a person's religion based on the region they lived in. If you lived in a Protestant area, he just mentally put you in the Protestant column.
Wait, really? So if there was a rich Catholic family living in a Protestant city, Weber might have just counted them as Protestant to fit his theory.
That's the critique. It completely ignores the fact that there might be wealthy Catholics in those areas who just weren't, shouting about their religion. If you don't ask, your data is fundamentally flawed.
So the math is shaky, but the source has an even bigger argument, right? The one you call the chronological killer. This felt like the knockout punch to me.
This is what really dismantles the thesis. Causality has one very strict rule. The cause must come before the effect.
Right, basic physics. You can't have the smoke before the fire.
And the source argues that capitalist institutions, the structures, the behavior, the financial tools, were fully operational centuries before the Protestant Reformation even happened. Luther nailed his theses to the door in 1517.
But the source is pointing to sophisticated economic systems in the 1100s and 1200s.
Exactly. So if capitalism is already running at full steam in the 12th century, a religious movement in the 16th century can't be its inventor. It's like saying the iPhone was invented because of a TikTok trend that happened last week. The timeline just doesn't work.
But that brings us to a really important point. We have to define our terms. If we're claiming capitalism existed in the Middle Ages, we need to agree on what capitalism is, because I think of knights and serfs and mud, not market dynamics.
That's a common misconception, and our source is very, very careful here. We aren't just talking about greed or trading stuff. Greed is universal. The source defines capitalism very specifically.
Okay, lay it on me. What are the criteria?
It requires stable, privately owned firms, complex commercial activities in a relatively free market, systematic long-term investment and reinvestment of profits. And, this is crucial, the use of hired labor.
See, when you list them out like that, stable firms, reinvestment, hired labor, that sounds like a modern corporation. It sounds like Silicon Valley. It's really hard to picture that in a monastery.
And yet, that is exactly where the source takes us. This is the big reveal. The concept of religious capitalism.
Religious capitalism. It sounds like an oxymoron. We're taught you can't serve God and mammon, right?
It does seem contradictory. But look at the trajectory of the Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries. The original idea was self-sufficiency. A monastery should grow its own food, make its own clothes, just be a little island of prayer.
Subsistence farming, basically. Just enough to get by.
At first. But these orders were disciplined, educated, and literate. They became incredibly good at what they did. So they moved from subsistence to surplus very fast. And then they moved to specialization.
Which is the key economic unlock, isn't it? When you stop trying to do everything yourself and just focus on the one thing you're best at.
Exactly. The source mentions the Cistercians in Fossa Nova, Italy. They didn't just run a farm. They specialized in breeding high-quality horses. Other estates focused entirely on wine or cattle or wool. Now, what happens when you specialize?
Well, if I only make wine, I have way too much wine for me, but I have zero bread, so I have to trade.
You have to enter the market. And we're not talking about trading a sack of potatoes at the local village. The scale here was massive. The source describes the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland. I know you looked this one up, founded way back in 612.
Yeah, I saw a map of the plan for it from around 820 AD. It's huge. It doesn't look like a church. It looks like a small city.
It was a vast complex. It had workshops, warehouses, factories, schools, housing for a huge population of workers. The source compares it to a temple city of antiquity. It was an industrial hub.
So you have these massive industrial hubs run by monks. This raises a question for me, though. Why were monks better at business than the actual nobility? Dukes and earls owned all this land. Why did the monks win the economic game?
The source points to one specific competitive advantage: meritocracy.
Meritocracy. In the Middle Ages. I thought that whole era was defined by who your dad was.
For the nobles, yes. Think about it. Who runs the estate when the duke dies?
His eldest son.
Right. And is that son necessarily smart? Is he good with numbers? Or is he just a spoiled kid who likes jousting?
It's a total genetic lottery. You could get a genius or a total disaster.
Exactly. But in a monastery, the abbot, the CEO, essentially was elected by the monks. They usually chose the person who was actually good at administration. And because the monastery doesn't die when the abbot dies, you have institutional continuity.
Right.
They could plan for 50 years down the road.
That makes so much sense. You've got professional management versus a family heirloom. It's like a modern corporation versus a family-run corner store.
And the historian Georges Duby, who's quoted in the source, notes that this forced monks to learn domestic economy. They had to calculate profit and loss. They were the first group in Europe to really treat economics as a science.
Okay, so they have the management structure, but to be a capitalist, you need capital. You need money. And I thought the Middle Ages was all about the barter system. trading chickens for shoes.
Chicken problem, you might call it.
Yeah. I mean, imagine trying to run a complex business on barter. I need to buy a new plow from Italy. Here are 300 chickens. It's a logistical nightmare.
Exactly. Barter is incredibly inefficient. It kills liquidity. And the source explains that because these monasteries were specializing, making only wine, for example, they couldn't barter for every single nail and brick they needed. It was too complex. They had to move to money.
So they adopted cash not because they loved gold, but because of logistics. It was just more efficient.
It was. And because they were so profitable, they accumulated a lot of it. And this is where it gets really interesting. They didn't just sit on the gold. They became the bankers for the nobility.
The monks were lending money to the dukes.
Constantly. The source details how monasteries and bishops became the primary source of credit in Europe. And they introduced some pretty sophisticated financial instruments. Have you ever wondered where the word mortgage comes from?
I assume it's French.
It is. Mort means dead, and gage means pledge, a dead pledge.
Yeah, that sounds ominous.
In the medieval context, it meant the lender, the monastery, held the land as security. And crucially, the lender kept all the income from that land during the loan period. The income was dead to the borrower. If you couldn't pay, the monastery just kept the land.
Wow. That is it's brilliant business, but it's ruthless. It's basically predatory lending, 12th century style.
It definitely shows a sophisticated grasp of asset management. And there's one final pillar of capitalism our source mentions: labor relations.
Right, because the definition involves hired labor. But I thought the rule was ora et labora, pray and work. Weren't the monks supposed to be out there hoeing the fields themselves?
That was the original rule of St. Benedict. But as the operations grew and the liturgy, the prayer services became more complex, they ran into a time management problem. If you have to be in the chapel 7 times a day for these elaborate chants, you just can't also be out in the field.
So they outsourced it.
They became the executives. They hired lay workers, peasants who weren't monks, to run the fields and the workshops. So now you have a situation where the owners of the capital, the monks, are managing hired labor for profit.
Which is, by every definition we just laid out, a capitalist corporation. You have shareholders, the monks, a CEO, the abbot, hired labor, and profit maximization.
It fits every single criterion.
This brings us to the cultural side of things, the Protestant work ethic. The idea that work is a virtue. If the monks were capitalists, did they have the work ethic too? Because I always thought that was the one thing the Protestants really did invent.
That's the myth the source really tries to bust. I mean, think about the ancient world. In Roman times, work was despised.
Right. The Roman gentlemen had slaves do everything. And in China, the mandarins grew those super long fingernails to prove they never lifted a finger.
Exactly. The goal of life was otium leisure. Work was degrading.
So how did that change? Because today, we all identify with our jobs.
St. Benedict, 6th century. He writes in his rule for monasteries, idleness is the enemy of the soul.
Idleness is the enemy of the soul. That's a powerful rebranding for work.
It shifted the entire paradigm. Work wasn't a punishment for slaves anymore. It was a path to holiness, a way to serve God. The source argues that these medieval monks had the Protestant ethic without Protestantism. They practiced frugality, they honored hard work, centuries before Martin Luther was even born.
So the psychological driver was already there. It just wasn't about, am I saved? It was about, am I serving God in my community?
Yes. And it wasn't just in the monasteries. The source throws in this fascinating little detail to show how widespread this was. We usually think of the Dutch or the English starting the first joint stock companies in the 1600s.
The Dutch East India Company, yeah, that's the textbook example.
It is. But the source points to the Société des Moulins du Bazacle in Toulouse, France, founded in 1250.
1250, that's almost 400 years earlier.
It was a milling company owned by shareholders. You could buy and sell shares. The value fluctuated based on the mill's profits. It was a purely capitalist joint stock corporation operating in the middle of the 13th century.
That's mind-blowing. It really proves the point that this spirit existed way, way earlier than we think. It wasn't some sudden invention by a guy in Geneva.
And that leads to the source's broader philosophical conclusion that capitalism wasn't invented by a theorist in a tower. It wasn't invented by Calvinists in some moment of anxiety. It was a co-evolution.
A co-evolution of what?
Of human desire for improvement, freedom, and ingenuity. When you give people the freedom to trade and improve their lot, these systems just emerge naturally. The monks were just the first ones organized and educated enough to really let it flourish.
Now, before we wrap, we have to touch on the source's final point. It gets a little controversial here. The author takes a swing at how modern history and even the modern church views this whole legacy.
Yes. The source argues that since the rise of Marxism in the 19th century, history has been sort of reinterpreted to vilify capitalism.
Mm.
We've been taught to see it as this oppressive alien force that crushes the worker.
And the source is saying the Catholic Church itself has kind of bought into this.
The author argues that the church has been contaminated by these Marxist critiques. By forgetting its own history, forgetting that monks were the original capitalists, and forgetting places like the School of Salamanca where free markets were viewed pretty positively, the church now often criticizes capitalism using Marxist language.
That's a heavy irony. The institution that practically built the system has forgotten it built it.
That is the author's stance. The argument is, if Weber had just looked at the real history, and if we stripped away that Marxist lens, we'd see that the spirit of capitalism is actually the spirit of the monastery.
It really forces you to rethink the term Dark Ages, doesn't it?
Completely. We tend to think of that time as stagnant and backwards. But if the foundations of modern finance, corporate structure, banking, and even the work ethic were all built then, maybe it was an era of incredible innovation.
It makes you wonder what other modern inventions are actually centuries older than we give them credit for. We're all sitting here using debit cards and working 9-to-5s, basically living a lifestyle designed by medieval monks.
We are all living in St. Benedict's world, whether we realize it or not.
That's a fantastic thought to end on. I want to thank you for walking us through all this. It's been a real eye-opener.
My pleasure. It's always good to question the standard story.
And to you, listening, thanks for joining this deep dive into the surprising history of faith and finance. Next time you clock in for work, just remember, you're following in the footsteps of a 12th century monk. See you next time.